Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, the Hideko Tomazawa Endowment, the Physics Department, and by gifts from friends of the program.
Why hunter-gatherers? Let me give you a little background on this for some who may not be familiar. Most of first of all, humans, critters that we will call human, and if you're looking at these skulls over here, they're not former graduate students. These are casts of human skulls, with the exception of the one on the right. That's a chimpanzee. And one thing you can see, obviously, is the brain got bigger. The face got flattened like we ran into a brick wall. These are some of the obvious trends. We'll often in anthropology and archaeology and so forth talk about hominids or hominins. That includes anybody that we think is ancestral in some form or other to ourselves. And hominids or hominins have been on this planet for somewhere between 5 and 7 million years. We share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. Chimps are our nearest living relatives. Now, what you may not realize is that things that we take as typical of humans, farming, for example, is brand new. When you look at it in a perspective of a 5 to 7 million year tenure on this planet, agriculture is at most 10 to 12,000 years old. So I put farming and everything that comes after, including, the biblical sites in the Near East and so forth, as what I call sort of politely the Kmart specials. It's all the veneer on the surface. More than 99% of our existence on this planet has been as hunters and gatherers, that is, people without farming. So when talking about human evolution, a lot of us are trying to understand what the common ancestor was like that ultimately gave rise to us and gave rise to chimpanzees. And so in developing models and testable hypotheses about the past and what this common ancestor might have been like and how we as a species evolved, we turn to hunter-gatherers, not to farmers, as a source of models. And we turn to chimpanzees as an alternative source of models. What is human about being human? Darwin looked at what we knew about hunter-gatherers. And there were some obvious traits. Big brain was one of the most obvious. Hunting was another one. All of the hunter-gatherers he knew about did a lot of hunting and a lot of big game hunting. And the other things that he talked about, for instance, bipedalism, walking on two legs. That's another strange feature of humans. We are blessed with the most useless feet in the world. Try peeling a banana with your feet. It just doesn't work very well. So we're highly specialized. Now, something that Darwin was unaware of, because he had no fossil record to work with, is that bipedalism, he thought these all went together somehow as a package. And we now realize that bipedalism and maybe reduced canines are the two quintessential human traits, and particularly big animals. Hunters went out and spent a lot of effort tracking and killing large animals. And he thought that this was a critical part of what made us human. The traditional idea is that men bring the meat back, women bring the plants back, they share with each other and particularly with their offspring. And this is kind of the classic model of hunting and gathering societies, and this was in part what was on Darwin's mind in trying to explain how you'd get from this common ancestor to a modern hunter-gatherer. There would be this origin somewhere of the division of labor, with males being the hunters, females being the gatherers. What I'm going to try to show you today is that that's probably wrong. That we have a division of labor, but I think the division of labor is largely political. It involves gender politics, and that the female gathering activities are not necessarily complementing the hunting, they actually underwrite it and make it possible. It's dangerous no matter what field you are in to cross into somebody else's field, because we don't have the same background, we don't know where all the hidden arguments are and assumptions and so forth. On the other hand, I think many of the most interesting ideas ultimately come at the interface with other disciplines. And the boundaries of disciplines are artificial and in some cases actually counterproductive. And I enjoy trespassing, and I would love to see more of it. I like to encourage students to do that, because so much of what we're trying to understand is going to come from other fields. Like as an archaeologist, I would like to know more about human nutrition, biology, biochemistry, molecular biology, economics, political science. It doesn't matter what the field is. They all have something to say about these issues. Okay, let's talk about the man-the-hunter view. Perhaps the best known study, and actually if I go back for a second, this book that is shown on the right had a huge impact on the field. It was by two anthropologists, Richard Lee and Irv DeVore, and it was a Harvard Kalahari project, the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. Richard Lee went off to the Bushmen in Botswana. They're located, for any of you who've been in Botswana, in the northwestern corner of Botswana, close to the Namibian border, not far from the Okavango swamps, an incredible area. And Lee went there in the 60s to do his doctoral dissertation work. He brought in many others, anthropologists, medical people, and so forth. This became a major interdisciplinary research endeavor. It had a huge impact on the field. Came out, it was published in 1968. And one of the ironies of it, and I'll just mention it here, is that the title of the conference and what got published was Man the Hunter. And one of Lee's major contributions was that the major food providers are women. And this has subsequently led to a backlash, and there are many articles and books now with the title Woman the Gatherer. Because this reflects a long-term bias, prejudice, whatever you want to call it, in the field. I don't know if there are any of you in the audience that have ever seen the classic film The Hunters. This was a film that was shown in virtually every intro anthro class in the 1960s and 70s. Fabulous film about the Bushmen out hunting giraffe. And at the same time, Lee was publishing about how 60 to 80% of the diet of the Bushmen came from women's gathering. And yet what students went away with from their intro anthro classes was Bushmen tracking giraffe all over the wastelands of the Kalahari. So there's this real disjunct, and it continues today. That is, hunting, big game hunting, is still viewed, in a sense, as what hunter-gatherers are all about. Okay, it seems very logical. The division of labor is thought to be, by many, thought to be basically economic. Women provide the carbohydrates, men provide the protein. It works great. Each can kind of specialize in what they do. They pool their resources and provide their offspring. So it's, you share with each other, and particularly you share, this is the male being involved in provisioning offspring, not just the mama. It's also a great way of pooling risk. All right? The idea is that hunter-gatherers share, generally, not only with family, but with others. And the idea is if you fail on day one to get something, sharing will make sure that you come out with something anyways. And then the next day or the next week, the initial person who provided food fails, but you succeed, and so then you provide them. And over the long run, then you have some kind of balance that leads to a pooling of risk and a lessening of risk overall. And there's a lot of logic to this. Big game hunting makes sense. If hunting is nutritionally driven, and particularly for protein, then it's a lot more effective to bring in a moose or an eland or something than it is to bring in a mouse. And so the logic is that What was limiting hunters bringing in big animals was largely technology. As their technologies got better, they were better and better able to target big animals. And so a lot of the human story from Darwin's time onward was humans getting better and better and better and smarter and smarter and smarter at going out there and knocking off the big critters. So now let's take a look at some of these. Here's Darwin. This is, I'm sure, familiar to you all. The Origin of Species was kind of the landmark study for the development of evolutionary theory. And then, but he was very cautious and stayed away from human evolution in The Origin of Species. And it's not until The Descent of Man where he tackles the issue of human evolution head on. And from Darwin's writings, and it's fascinating to read, from Darwin's writings, you can see what we now come to call a feedback model. It's laid out quite nicely. You have a series of variables that are attributes that Darwin thought were critical in human evolution. Big brains was number one. Tool using and tool making was another one. Humans are very dependent on culture and tools in the way they relate to the environment and to each other. Hunting he viewed as the key to this, or as a key in this. That what are you doing with these tools? You're providing food. What's the food? It's all these new species of antelopes that were evolving in the savannas of sub-Saharan Africa. How do you use these tools effectively? You got to get up on your hind feet to do it. Now, there's obviously a shorthand here. You don't decide one day, I've got this tool here, but I can't use it because I'm a four-legged animal. I better turn myself into a two-legged animal. It's obviously a gradual selection process that he envisioned where you'd have a feed. This is where the feedback comes from. More effective tool use is made possible by bipedalism as well as by a larger brain. If you're smarter, you can make better tools and use them more effectively. So all of these would fit together in this feedback system. Now, it's kind of, part of this has fallen apart. We now know that bipedalism precedes brain size increase probably by more than 3 million years. Now, as we were out there running around on two legs with a chimpanzee-sized brain for at least 3 million years before we started making stone tools, hunting or killing animals, and so forth. But if you take bipedalism out of it, it still kind of fits. All right, the genus Homo, us, appears about 2.5 million years ago, and that's when you find the first stone tools and the first archaeological sites. By that I mean tools in a single location clustered with piles of animal bones that have cut marks on them clearly made by tools. So maybe Darwin was wrong with the bipedalism, but let's just shift it forward to 2.5 million. You get an increase in brain size then. You get archaeological sites all of a sudden. It's the meat eating, the hunting meat eating still fits very nicely. It just doesn't explain the origins of hominids. It explains the origin of the genus Homo. And that's where it stands today. This shows you the increase in brain size, and I brought in some casts that show this as well. You've got the Australopithecines on the left. This particular one dated around 2.5 million with a brain that's about 380 cubic centimeters, not all that different from a chimpanzee. Then you have Homo erectus or Homo ergaster. There are different names being used that lived from, let's say, about a little less than 2 million up to, depending on who you read, let's say 300,000 years ago. So a long time. And their brain size is not static. It's increasing, and it starts out somewhere around 700 cubic centimeters, let's say 1.5 or so million years ago. And by, let's say 400,000, you're up to 1,200, almost to modern brain size, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 cubic centimeters. Obviously, it varies populationally, so no single figure will capture the variability. Meat eating, this also fits Darwin's predictions. The archaeology, you've probably all heard of Olduvai Gorge and the classic work of Mary and Louis Leakey, and we have many other localities now which document the same thing, starting around 2.5 million years ago. Stone tools, cut marks on butchered bones, forming dense clusters, multiple species in these clusters, meaning that humans had transported animal bones to a fixed location on the landscape. It starts to sound like hunter-gatherers. And in fact, people have postulated that by 2 million years ago, we already have a division of labor, with males going out and knocking off the big critters and the females gathering. That one of the tragedies of archaeology is that we have a heck of a hard time seeing the plant remains. And there's a bias, obviously. Not only are we more likely to see fossilized bones than plants, we're more likely to see fossilized bones of big critters more easily than the bunnies that they might have brought back. But I don't know if you can see in this projection, the bone at the far right is an ankle bone, and there are cut marks exactly where you'd expect them for cutting ligaments and so forth. And these show up by 2.5 million years ago. So we have pretty good proof that humans were exploiting these animals, and presumably they're doing it for meat. And the usual assumption is why the meat? Well, presumably the major target is protein. Bipedalism, we have good evidence for it. We have it in the fossil record itself. That is, we have the pelvis and the knee. If you've ever seen a chimp walk, I could make a total fool of myself here, but if you could just picture a chimp, they can't lock their knees, and the upper hind legs flare out, ours flare in. We can lock our knees. We have a highly specialized foot where the big toe is lined up with the rest of the foot. You can see this, hopefully you can see the picture of the chimp at the bottom with a big toe just like a hand. The thumb or big toe sticking out, and they can use it very much like a hand. We also have these very famous footprints from a locality called Laetoli in Tanzania. It's not all that far from Olduvai Gorge, maybe 20, 30 kilometers to Laetoli. This was a volcanic ash that was wet. Two hominids, we don't know whether they were holding hands, at around 3.5 million years ago, walked through this, leaving their footprints. They then became solidified, filled with sediment of a different color and texture, and very easy to recognize. They were excavated initially by Mary Leakey. And they provide beautiful proof that by 3.5 million, humans were obligate bipeds. They had a useless foot just like ours. When I say useless, obviously it's great for walking, but it creates more problems than you might have thought about. A chimpanzee infant can cling to the hair on mama's body. Mama doesn't have to hold it. But if you're a biped, you can't cling anymore. So there are lots of changes that are going on that bipedalism hints at. Likewise, the reduction of the canines in these early critters. The canines, we believe, are primarily used by males in displays against and towards other males. So the fact that they have declined in these early critters suggests some dramatic changes in the entire social fabric of these groups. Now what this slide shows, what you've got on the vertical axis on the left is brain size, and on the axis to the right is body weight. And what it shows is that humans, relative to their body weight, have encephalized incredibly. That is, we've gotten unbelievably big brains. And the million-dollar question, or one of the million-dollar questions, of course, is why? And you can see the Australopithecines down there by the chimp. They're pretty similar in brain size. And it's with this character called Homo habilis, let's say roughly 2 million years, maybe 2.5 million years ago, when you get a doubling of brain size. And then it just sort of goes on towards this incredibly brainy modern human. Now this leads to an interesting question. The brain is an incredibly expensive organ. It uses, when you're resting, about 20% of your calories. So it's a very expensive organ. And given that, you'd expect the metabolism, the resting metabolism, that is the amount of energy that you need when you're resting, the total amount that your body needs, you'd expect it to have gone up compared to other primates, to the other apes. But it hasn't. In other words, we have this incredibly expensive organ, much more so, using much more energy than a chimp or a gorilla. And yet our total energy needs have not changed. So the question is, how could that have come about? And a biological anthropologist named Leslie Aiello came up with a very interesting, very influential model. Looking at the guts, the intestines of different primates, including humans, we have a greatly reduced gut size. And the gut is another very expensive organ. And what she hypothesized was that the way humans did this was, as the brain increased, the gut size shrank, so that the total energy needs remained more or less constant. But in order to do that, to have a smaller gut, you had to improve the quality of the food. And so everybody, or almost everybody, not Aiello, interestingly enough, but almost everybody else immediately says, aha, of course, meat, what else? Here's this high-quality food. It's one of those truisms. It's high quality, and so the way they accomplished this, and we can see it in the archaeological record, they started knocking off big game. And the bigger the game, the better, because the package size makes it a more effective way of acquiring this high-quality food. So you're limited largely by your technology. So as you get a better technology, better weapons systems, you can knock off bigger animals and provide that energy for the brain. A few have suggested cooking, and cooking is a really important thing, but one that is frustratingly difficult to get at. You might think that charcoal would preserve forever, but unfortunately it doesn't. And so we have a great deal of difficulty tracking fire. I would say we have pretty solid, convincing evidence of fire back to about 1 million. But this brain size increase with Homo habilis may have started 2.5 million years ago, 1 million years earlier. Some have hypothesized, yeah, they probably had cooking already then, but we don't have archaeological evidence for it. Now, it might seem obvious, as a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, what could be easier than recognizing a basin dug in the ground and lined with rocks? Unfortunately, even modern hunter-gatherers, for the most part, do not dig basins, and they do not use rocks to line the fireplace. So you get one good wind and the ash just blows away. And in fact, what a lot of modern hunter-gatherers, when I say modern, in the historic period, where we have written descriptions, they may build a fire in one place, but when they sleep, like the Australian Aborigines, they simply brush the coals around their body so that they stay warm at night. And then during the day, they just get up and leave, and all of that just blows away. So fireplaces, cooking remains very difficult to identify during the critical period of, let's say, around 2 to 2.5 million years ago. So what everybody zeroes in on is meat, and particularly protein. So what I want to do now, let's just check my time here. What I want to do now is very briefly look at some problems concerning protein as a food. And I'm going to go through this really briefly here. I'm going way out on the limb, giving you all the saw to cut it off with, because obviously I'm not trained as a nutritionist, but I think there's a lot of interesting insights here. Let's start with protein malnutrition. I think it's fair to call it a love affair that we have with protein. In the West in particular, and it was perhaps most extreme from the 1940s through the 1970s. I'll give you a little background to it. It's now, by the way, often not referred to as protein malnutrition or kwashiorkor, but protein energy malnutrition or protein calorie malnutrition. In 1932, a medical officer, Cicely Williams, working in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, identified and named childhood kwashiorkor, protein deficiency. She was observing children who had who were eating lots of maize, and there were very serious deficiency syndromes which she identified and basically corrected with protein. What happened was, however, in the 1940s through 70s, the World Health Organization got on the bandwagon, and they declared it a worldwide crisis. It fit with the Cold War beautifully. We had surplus skim milk, which we could give to people, and we were manufacturing all kinds of protein substitutes. And ultimately, the United Nations itself and World Health Organization declared protein as a world crisis, and political instability and so forth in many cases was attributed ultimately to protein deficiencies. So what I want to do is read you a quote. I think it's easier for me to read it to you than to project it up here. This is by a guy named Donald McLaren, a nutritionist who wrote this in 1974. The concept of the much publicized world protein gap arose from the description of kwashiorkor in Africa in the 1930s, and the assumption, which has turned out to be wrong, that malnutrition in children takes this form throughout the world. As a result, measures to detect protein deficiency and treat and prevent it by dietary means have been pursued until the present time. The price that has had to be paid for these mistakes is only beginning to be realized. And I will document some of this a little more. One of the things that I got interested in was the archaeology of this, the archaeological evidence for being concerned about excess protein, too much protein. It's something that nutritionists, when I started asking nutritionists about this, they looked at me like I was nuts. And because basically the issue in their minds was too little protein. This has changed recently with the interest in Atkins diets and other diets, and with the emphasis now in athletic training of protein supplements and so forth. When I was a college student, you carbohydrate loaded and so forth. Now there's a lot more use of protein supplements and also specific amino acid supplements. Well, I got interested in this in archaeology when I excavated a bison kill and found that the hunters prehistorically, this is a kill in New Mexico, that the hunters were killing both bulls and cows. These are bison bulls and cows, and yet they were throwing away lots of parts of the cows. And I didn't understand this. These were spring kills. It just didn't make sense. So I began to look at the explorer literature, which is now beautifully easy with Google Books, because you can keyword search all of these dusty tomes that have been locked away in rare book rooms. And I can sit in bed 5,000 miles away and rummage the rare book library. It's incredible. At any rate, let me read you two quotes. And then this will be the end of quotes. One is by Randolph Marcy. He was a military officer in the mid-1800s in the plains, the American plains. He was in Wyoming in the winter, ran out of food, and marched with some soldiers and oxen and horses all the way to Santa Fe to get supplies. And here's what he said. We tried the meat of horse, colt, and mules, all of which were in a starved condition, and of course not very tender, juicy, or nutritious. We consumed the enormous amount of from 5 to 6 pounds of this meat per man daily, but continued to grow weak and thin until at the expiration of 12 days we were able to perform but little labor and were continually craving for fat meat. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of these things in the literature, not all in the Arctic either, although a lot of people think, well, this is maybe mostly a problem of winter in the Arctic or, in the Rocky Mountains or whatever. I have started going through the 18th and 19th century traveler accounts from sub-Saharan Africa. It's filled with the same thing. The classic quote is by Stephenson, who was an Arctic anthropologist and explorer. And this has been cited by a number of people. But this is also why a lot of people think this happens only in the Arctic. If you are transferred suddenly from a diet normal and fat to one consisting wholly of rabbit, You eat bigger and bigger meals for the first few days until at the end of about a week, you're eating in pounds 3 or 4 times as much as you were at the beginning of the week. By that time, you're showing both signs of starvation and of protein poisoning. You eat numerous meals, you feel hungry at the end of each, you're in discomfort through distension of the stomach with much food, and you begin to feel a vague restlessness. Diarrhea will start in from a week to 10 days and will not be relieved unless you secure fat. Death will result after several weeks. When I approached nutritionists about this, they thought, you know, this guy's off his rocker. First of all, nobody eats that much meat. Then I started looking at the pemmican literature. Pemmican, for those of you not familiar with it, is dried meat mixed with fat. And there were wars fought over control of pemmican, the pemmican industry in the northern plains. It was basically what permitted settlement and exploration of the subarctic. And all of the Arctic explorers in the early days used pemmican. And they're very explicit about what it has to contain. You can go back to the 18th century and find people saying they don't talk about it in calories, but they talk about it, it has to be at least half fat and the rest dried meat. And if you analyze that in terms of calories, it has to be at least 75% calories from fat. So explorers, missionaries, everybody else, there's hundreds of these things in the literature, knew very well that to survive, you cannot do it on lean meat. I always thought you just get love handles if you ate more than you needed, and it doesn't work that way. And basically, what it turns out is that you have to get rid of the nitrogen. And you basically, your liver, in deaminizing the amino acids and producing urea and excreting it, is rate limited. You can adapt, but only up to a certain point. This is an area for any of the medical folks here. We need a lot more information on what the limits actually are. But it appears as though after a period of about 2 weeks of adaptation, there's still a ceiling. And if you exceed that ceiling, your body basically can't get rid of the nitrogen. You can't pee fast enough basically to get rid of it. And you end up with ammonia building up in the blood and a lot of other symptoms that go along with this, and ultimately you die. And if you look at the 18th and 19th century literature, everybody but the medical profession knew this. The Arctic literature is filled with it. The African literature is filled with it. And in fact, we'll come back to this. The African case is particularly interesting because every explorer and adventurer that went out and killed every animal they could find in Africa would comment about how lousy they were as food because they have no fat. Okay, total protein requirements. This is animal protein. You're limited. It depends on your body size. Now, most of us are big or bigger. Most hunter-gatherers today are under 50 kilograms. Very small. Bushmen are around 40 kilograms. And so if you calculate the amount of protein that they can consume without exceeding this upper limit in a 24-hour period, it's about 35% of calories on average, and it runs about 200 grams. Now, that's protein, not meat. And meat has a lot of water in it. But that means that you're limited to how much you can use. So when you go out and kill a big animal, you're generating a toxic level of protein if you were to use it yourself. So you're sort of forced to give it away, we call it sharing, or wasting it. And the question then that I raise is, why go after these critters when there are all these little things out there like insects, which all hunter-gatherers ate, rodents and lizards, and lots of plant foods? Now, another thing where we need help from the medical professions is, what about the plant protein? Roughly 15% of Bushman calories come from plant protein. Is that additive with the animal nitrogen? In other words, the nitrogen from the plant foods? If so, that would lower these animal food figures considerably, that they could actually consume. If they're averaging 15% of their calories from plants, from plant protein, then, and if it's in any way additive, then the amount of meat that they can use is even lower. Okay, I can just summarize what's on this slide and this image very briefly. African animals, the bigger ones, what we call ungulates, the hoofed animals, are the leanest animals on the planet. In prime condition, they have less fat than, let's say, a white-tailed deer in late winter or early spring. And in other words, they have less fat when they're in prime condition than an almost starving deer, let's say, in Michigan would contain. And every explorer and gun-toting whatever European that went out there and shot anything that moved, they all comment on this over and over and over again. There are a few exceptions, but these are ones that are very difficult for hunter-gatherers to kill. One obvious animal that's fat all the time is the hippo. And the Europeans had fun when they sit on the edge of the shore with their rifle and wait till the eyes pop up above the water, and bam. And then it would sink for 3 hours, so they'd go away and do something else, then come back and the bodies floated to the surface. And then they loved the oil, and they'd sell it, and they'd trade it. People bought wives with the fat from hippos and so forth. But they're not easy to kill, except with firearms. Interestingly enough, and I'll come back to this, modern hunter-gatherers, the more they hunt, these are African hunter-gatherers, like the Bushmen and others, the more weight they lose. They're on an Atkins diet, and it's not what they need. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Protein is also a very expensive nutrient. Fat gives you roughly 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrate, about 4 calories per gram. Protein, 4 calories per gram. But it generates heat. That is, there's a cost to metabolizing it. And that cost could be anywhere up to 20 or 30%. Putting this in English, what this means is for every 100 calories of protein, you have to consume an extra 20 or 30 just to metabolize it. It's a lousy way to gain energy. Secondly, the brain doesn't use protein as an energy source. It uses either glucose and or ketone bodies, which are made from fat. So it's not an efficient way of getting calories. All right, so you have an upper ceiling to how much you can consume, and it's a very inefficient way of providing energy. Third, and this is really an interesting set of studies, during that craze, that protein craze, one of the things that we did worldwide and in our own inner cities in the States was we got to supplement the diets of pregnant women to deal with all the problems of underweight births, birth defects, and cognitive deficiencies and so forth. So what did they do? They fed them protein, skim milk, and then never looked at the results. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s that David Rush from Boston and others began to look retrospectively at the results of these early studies. And lo and behold, what they found was, yes, if you supplement the low end, you get improvement. But once you passed about 20% of calories, it went the other way again. You got cognitive deficiencies, you got underweight births, and so forth. In other words, it works at both ends. Too little protein, you have problems. Too much, you also have problems. Now, you might say, well, 20% of calories is a lot of protein. The Bushmen during the dry season are eating well in excess of 50% of calories. Why? Because there aren't many plant foods available and the animals are lean to start with, and that's their worst time of year. So they are on an ultimate extreme Atkins diet. And Bushmen traditionally have no body fat here. You cannot pinch the underarm of a Bushman. There's no fat there. They're not starving. They're just very, very lean. So the last thing they need is an Atkins diet. There are a couple other issues. We'll just go through these briefly. Taste. Raw meat is tasteless. It has an aroma of blood, and that's it. Now, people immediately ask, well, what about steak tartare and all sorts of other things like that? Yes, we eat them, but usually they involve all kinds of special treatments first. They often involve Worcestershire sauce, onions, all kinds of other things that are mixed in. Or in the case of sushi and other things, we eat them with all sorts of other things. What about, so a lot of the flavor of meat comes from cooking. Maillard reactions, the browning reaction, and a lot of other things. There are also a lot result from things like the things that are fat soluble and also occur when the meat becomes rancid and so forth. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of volatile compounds in meat that give it flavor, and many of these result from decay of the meat and or from various types of treatment, cooking, and so forth. So now the critical question is when does fire come in? Because if they're eating raw meat, why is it so attractive? And it's a non-issue with chimps. We've found over the last couple of decades that chimps also eat meat, and they obviously aren't cooking it. And I don't want to get into psychology here, although I have the feeling we're going to have to get into this. I don't want to go back to the 1950s killer ape stuff, but I'm not sure where to go with this. But we don't understand what is attractive about meat. Now you might say, well, what about umami or umami? This was a, it's the MSG, the flavoring enhancer that you can put on foods. It's often thought to be a pleasant sensation that you get from foods that are high in protein. One of the interesting things about it, if you look at studies of malnourishment and undernourishment, it has the funny effect. Umami is apparently not a pleasant sensation if you have an inadequate intake of protein, which would suggest that it's not a signal that says, hey, I'm short of protein, I need more protein. It seems to kick in once your protein levels are adequate. If that's the case, it's also not an explanation for what is driving chimps and humans to eat raw meat. Okay, protein in the brain. The anthropological literature is filled with statements about we have this voracious machine called a brain that needs a huge amount of energy, and they often equate energy in this case with protein. There's the high quality food. We need protein. That's what meat is doing. Well, if you look at it, this is where you need protein. The brain is mostly fat and water. And the fat is a number of different fats, but one in particular, a very special fat, which is one of these omega-3 fatty acids. DHA makes it nice and simple. It's docosahexaenoic acid. But DHA will do just fine. DHA you do not get from meat. You get it from eating brain, or you can get it from fish and so forth, aquatic resources. And this is what you hear about. You got to eat more fish and so forth. So what a lot of anthropologists now say, all right, we recognize there's a problem with too much protein, so they're killing these big animals to get their brain because they need the DHA. Now there's real interesting studies, and I can only touch on this briefly here. There's a huge literature on DHA because there's this question of how can the mama produce her own DHA in sufficient quantities to meet the needs of the infant, the development of the infant brain, through breast milk, and if you're not breastfeeding, do you have to supplement the formula that you give them to get DHA? Now, one of the things that blows my mind here is that until the year 2000, most of the studies on the ability to biosynthesize DHA was done on men. God knows why, but it's only after about 2000 where they started to look at women specifically, and they found, lo and behold, women are much more efficient at producing DHA than men are, and especially it's estrogen modulated, and so it may well go hand in hand with pregnancy and nursing. Also, women store fat here more than men who store it here, and interestingly enough, they sequester a higher percentage here of DHA than men do, and it becomes mobile primarily when they're nursing. So, the DHA argument, first of all, it doesn't make sense. Why would you go after a giraffe if the only thing you can really use, it's the DHA that you need, to kill an animal the size of a giraffe just to eat the brain? The other side of this is aquatic resources, shellfish, fish, and so forth. There's no archaeological evidence to support it. It's a one good way, and we get it today through all kinds of fish oil supplements and so forth, but the hominid record, the use of marine and aquatic resources, does not show up on any large scale until 200,000 years ago. By then you're dealing with a fully modern brain. So it cannot explain, as far as I'm concerned, how humans managed to develop the large brain and support the large brain in the first place. What about breast milk? Breast milk, this is where my kids think archaeology is kind of the weirdest field on the planet, because I've been looking at things like body fat and breast milk composition and all these other things, and they're still shaking their head wondering, you know, what is archaeology? At any rate, humans have the lowest protein breast milk on the planet. So if protein was what was driving and feeding this voracious brain, it sure as heck doesn't show up in the composition of breast milk. All of the apes are very, very low. Now let's look at the human infant. The human infant is not storing protein but fat. Compare that to the chimp, and I don't know whether with the lights you can see that. The infant chimp is sort of in the arms of the mama there. This little infant has quite a six-pack. No fat. It looks like a wrinkled prune. So if you can't see it, there basically is no body fat, or hardly any, on an infant chimp. It's unique to humans. We are fatter than baby seals. So we don't have a good explanation. There's a lot of literature on this, but it's a really interesting problem. Why is it that the humans, both the human adult and the human infant, has a phenomenal capacity to store fat and a very low protein and actually comparatively low calorie milk? And this has to do with something about early human adaptations, which we can hypothesize all kinds of things, but none of the arguments yet are particularly convincing. But I think it shows that protein is not the key variable here. Also, if you look at food aversions, cross-culturally, food taboos and aversions, in pregnancy, morning sickness, as well as cross-culturally taboos, it's women especially who are tabooed access to meat. It is the most widespread common aversion and food taboo, which is really interesting. I suspect hunter-gatherers knew something that we don't. There have been a lot of new studies or recent studies that have become very quantitative. People are now counting and weighing. And the two best documented groups now in sub-Saharan Africa are the Hadza in Tanzania and the Bushmen in southern Africa. They were in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Angola, and little bits in Zambia and so forth. Let's look at their big game hunting. The Bushmen fail 77% of the time. The Hadza fail 97% of the time. This is on big game hunting. And these are our best known big game hunters. Both groups lose body weight. The more they hunt, the lower their body weight. Now part of it is because they're running around the landscape. But part of it is they sit behind blinds waiting for the animals to come to the water hole, and they're still losing weight. Basically, they're on an Atkins diet. Now, what about the division of labor? We have numerous studies now that show that what the men do makes perfect sense so long as you ignore what the women do. That is, they'll target the highest rank resources. They'll go after the giraffe before they go after the mouse. All of that makes perfect sense. But we have study after study that shows now that if men did what women do, their return rates would be much higher. And we have studies that show that they would not be competing with the women. In other words, it's not that they're all aiming for the same plant resources. So then you have to ask, well, why in the heck are they out there? Now let's talk about Bushman bows. This has always fascinated me, but I never put two and two together until my 12-year-old decided he wanted to do archery. So I went to Cabela's and said, okay, what do you recommend for a 12-year-old? And they said, oh, not more than about a 20-pound bow. Then I looked at the Bushman bows, and they qualify for the age 6 to 12. That's their bow. this seems sort of weird. Okay, then their hunting strategy. Now I went back to early travel accounts again, and they're marvelous. They all say that, they're all afraid of the poison that the Bushmen put on the arrows. But they all comment on the fact that they're the lousiest bows in the world, and that there's one lovely quote by Charles Dickens, Jr. I don't think it's his own original observations, but he published it in a magazine anonymously, so I don't know who the author is. But it says, to an animal shot by a Bushman arrow, it's kind of like being stung by a bee or something, and you bite the arrow and pull it out and walk away as though nothing had happened, and then drop dead later on from the poison. But in other words, it's not lethal shots. These bows are so flimsy that they have to get to within 20 meters of the animal. And then you have to shoot it where the skin is thin enough that the arrow can penetrate to get the poison in the bloodstream. But usually it's in the leg. All right, which is certainly just makes the animal a little bit angry. The poisons are slow acting. They can take up to 24 hours to take effect. In fact, the Bushmen often go home and rest for a while. And then they come out and track, and the average tracking is 1.5 days per animal. And of those that they've managed to shoot, they lose about half of them. By the time they finally find it, the animal's been eaten by a hyena or a lion. So you have to ask, is this a way of putting food on the table? You fail, the Bushmen fail 77% of the time. What they do hit, they spend a day and a half on average looking for it, and then of those they only succeed in getting half of them. Now, the Hadza are also equally weird in that they use a 100-pound bow, which almost nobody can pull, and they fail 97% of the time. Now, another real shocker was when we began to quantify who was sharing with whom. Papa, when he brings home the meat, doesn't share it with wife and kids. He shares it with non-kin. This was really an eye-opener. And we have several studies now that show this, that the sharing is mostly with non-kin. And in fact, the ones who get the least direct benefit from the hunting is family. They're not putting food on their own table. Also, we've discovered that once a good hunter, always a good hunter. Once a klutz, always a klutz. So the reciprocity isn't there. It's always certain individuals are the best hunters. We now have quantitative data on how long it takes them to learn the hunt. 35 to 45 years. It takes them that long to fail 97% of the time. It's really bizarre, all right? Also, there are all kinds of other foods that are available that provide as much protein, admittedly, maybe not the same digestibility and quality, much higher levels of fat. And to me, the real eye-opener is these are available at exactly the same time that they do most of their hunting. It's not that they eat these plant foods or mopani worms when game is in short supply. They're available at exactly the time when they do most of their hunting, which leads me to believe that they are actually, that these other foods are actually underwriting this peculiar habit that they have of spending hours and hours and hours chasing animals around the landscape. Mongongo nuts is one you hear a lot about. This is just a picture of a Bushman camp in a mongongo grove. Very high in fat. Mopani worms, it may be a little dark, but that's a 5 pula coin from Botswana. And on the reverse side, it's a Mopani worm shown. They export it by the thousands of tons. I have this wonderful description, I should be doing it here, of a professor lecturing to his class while he's popping Mopani worms into his mouth. Basically, they're like Cheetos. This is one graph. This shows the Bushman hunting seasonality. And you can see during the wet season they do most of their hunting, and that's precisely when these other resources are available. When they do their least hunting, that's when these other resources are also least available, although many of them are self-preserving. That is, these nuts fall on the ground and may stay edible for up to 8 or 9 months. And in fact, a lot of these groups, they pick them out of baboon poop. So they let the baboon harvest them. The baboon goes up the tree, harvests them, can't digest them, poops them out. They go collect them, clean them up. I'm glad it's not lunchtime yet. Now, well, we're almost at the end here. Let's look briefly at the Hadza. They're different from the Bushmen. The Bushmen did most of their hunting in the wet season. The Hadza do it mostly in the dry season. Now, if you think about it, this is the worst time for the animals. They're walking shoe leather to start with, and in the late dry season, they are in their worst possible condition. The game is just miserable at that time, and that's when they do most of it. They lose a lot of weight because their protein levels probably skyrocket. But that just so happens to coincide with the major harvest of baobab seeds. I love these trees. I'd love one in my backyard. The baobab is an incredible food with high amounts of fat. And they are at their peak in the late dry season. Again, I think it underwrites the hunting. Chimps are showing the same picture. We used to think that, first of all, we used to think that chimps were vegetarians. They didn't hunt at all. Then we discovered maybe 30 years ago that they were doing a lot of hunting. And over the years, we've gotten more and more data. And it's males that hunt. They do a lot of it. Initially, everybody thought it was protein. Then they realized, no, they're satiated with protein when they do it. Maybe it's vitamin B12 or something that you can only get from animal foods. That's been ruled out now. In fact, it seems to peak when fruiting peaks. In other words, when their normal staples are at their maximum, that's when hunting is at its maximum. So the conclusion is the chimps aren't hunting for nutritional reasons either. So, conclusions. Protein is an important nutrient. I'm not knocking it down. But I don't believe it was a driving force in human evolution, neither for the brain nor as an energy source. It's a very poor energy source. You don't need much protein. Beautiful study of a hunter-gatherer group in Paraguay. They hunt 7 hours a day, but according to the ethnologist who studied them, they fulfill their protein needs in a half an hour with no tools at all. They pick up armadillos and whack them against a tree. But then they spend the next 6.5 hours hunting. Why? I think the real question has to do with social factors and political factors. And if you want to really knock it down to the absurd, these are peacocks displaying their feathers. That it has a nice scientific name, although there are many competing models, known as costly signaling. It's a way of males establishing their reliability, their suitability as mates, their suitability as alliance partners. In other words, they're dependable folks. And it may have very little to do with nutrition. In other words, nutrition may be an add-on, but I don't think it's what drove it. Okay, let me stop there.
Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, the Hideko Tomazawa Endowment, the Physics Department, and by gifts from friends of the program.